Israel, this regime is the only one of its kind in the world, and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the Apartheid regime in South Africa. And you find that thing running through the human rights organization reports. You find it in political life outside the United States. It's even said that former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, he openly avowed that his aim was to create Bantustans of the South African model in the occupied territories. Just about 3 weeks ago, I was quite surprised to see, I was reading, some of you, I suspect, look at the Haaretz website, the website of Israel's main newspaper, Haaretz, and there was an editorial on the Haaretz website, and in the midst of the editorial, they just referred routinely, they just referred to the apartheid regime in the occupied territories. It wasn't even a matter of controversy. It just passed along in the editorial. So these analogies we're told we're not allowed to make because the conflict is so complicated and unique, but the purpose is, when you make those analogies, as I said, Israel always comes out on the wrong side. Well, is it complicated, this history of the conflict? It's interesting when you look at the actual historians and you look at the actual record. I don't have time to go through it now because Polly Mann put me on notice. And I have learned, even though I've been here for a very short time, don't cross Polly Mann. So I'm going to... because that will be madness. So I'll just look briefly at one example. Take the case of that historian I mentioned earlier, Benny Morris. He's written what's considered a standard history of the topic used in college classrooms. It's called Righteous Victims. How many people have seen Righteous Victims? Not too many, but a few. And Righteous Victims, at one point, he has to address the question, why did these Arabs of Palestine hate the Zionists? What was the root cause? And he writes, in passing, the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. The fear of territorial displacement and dispossession was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, some of you are wondering what's so important about that and why did I even repeat it twice? And the truth of the matter is, when I came across those lines, the words, metaphorically speaking, leapt off the page for me. For my students, it wouldn't have just been metaphor, but they're on drugs. Why did, one of my students is here, please don't report it back. Okay. I speak only with the highest regard for them everywhere. I heard a laugh. Okay, why did I mention that? Because notice what Morris didn't say. He said the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism was the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession. He didn't say it was hatred of Jews. He didn't say it was anti-Semitism. He didn't say it was fear of Enlightenment values. He didn't say it was dread of the emancipation of women. No, it was pretty straightforward. They opposed Zionism because they were afraid of losing their homes and losing their country. End of story. It was true then, and it's true now. And in fact, in any other conflict, the kinds of explanations which are conjured up in order to explain the impulses of Palestinians, those explanations would rightfully, I think, be seen as ludicrous. So let's take North America. We shouldn't be so politically correct as to forget that the indigenous resistance to Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. The Native Americans killed men, they killed women, they killed children. They weren't called terrorists, but if you look at the standard literature on the topic, they were called savages. And that was until fairly recently they were called savages. Because it was a very bloody resistance. Not to say the Euro-American settlers were angels. No, it was very ugly on both sides, for sure. But we shouldn't blind ourselves to the bloodiness of the resistance. Nonetheless, what would anyone say if a historian came along and claimed that the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, it was anti-Christianism or anti-whiteism or anti-Europeanism? You would laugh. You don't need exotic explanations for why they resisted. The obvious one also happens to be a sufficient one. They feared losing their homes and losing their country. And it was as true for the Native Americans then as it was for the Palestinians in the 20th century, as it is for the Palestinians now in the West Bank and Gaza. The second kind of fabricated controversy is the one which was the topic of today's talk, and I want to get to it now, namely the playing of the Holocaust card. There's a lot to say in that topic, and time doesn't allow me to do so this evening. I'll simply make a few comments about the Holocaust issue and then turn to the question of the anti-Semitism, which presumably is one of the reasons many of you came to hear me speak on that subject. The Nazi Holocaust, as I said, or I should say its role in American life, is a complicated one which I don't have time to go into. It's one which will come as a surprise to many people here, perhaps not to the older generation, but to the younger one. Namely, up until 1967, the Nazi Holocaust played or figured almost not at all in American Jewish life or in American life at all. American life generally. It wasn't a factor in cultural life in the United States up until the late 1960s. I have no time to explain why. I can just say briefly that after World War II, the United States immediately entered into an alliance with West Germany. It was our chief pillar in Europe, and much of the West German government and the elite classes and the professional classes, the professors, the lawyers, the doctors, the bureaucracy, it was staffed by ex-Nazis. And so you weren't allowed to talk about the Nazi Holocaust, because if you talked about it, you were undermining the U.S.-West German alliance, the U.S. alliance with the Federal Republic of Germany. You were reminding the world of what those same people had done a few years ago, and that was said to be playing into the hands of the communists, who talked a lot about what that West German government had done. Don't have time to go into that now. For our purposes, the important point to make is that after June '67, the Holocaust comes to figure very prominently in American cultural life, and its main contribution of what I call the Holocaust industry, this vast conglomerate of institutions and individuals, the main contribution of the Holocaust industry was what came to be called the Holocaust uniqueness argument. That is to say that no people ever in the history of humanity had suffered the way the Jews did. And in fact, to deny the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust came to be called a form of Holocaust denial. In fact, as a historical point, there's no basis for this claim of Holocaust uniqueness. Briefly, don't have time to go into it right now. Every historical event has unique features. Everyone understands that because it takes place in a certain time in a certain place. So that makes any historical event unique. And you can say the Nazi Holocaust, it's also true to say it had significantly unique features. And I think it'd be silly to deny that as well. The industrialized assembly line extermination of the Jews was a unique feature to the Nazi Holocaust, unquestionable in my opinion. But there's a very big difference between saying an event has significant unique features and saying that the event belongs in the category all its own, apart from all other genocides in history. That to me is religion. It's not politics any longer. It's a politically useful religion, but it has nothing to do with real history. During questions and answers, if you like, I'll go into that. In terms of the moral dimension of the Nazi Holocaust, to claim uniqueness, to me it's an abomination because it's ranking suffering. And it's impossible, as anybody in a moment's reflection can tell you, it's impossible to rank suffering. How can you claim, how can you prove, how can you demonstrate, why would you want to prove or demonstrate that, say, being shoved into a gas chamber is worse than having your flesh incinerated by napalm? That's the kind of game that you have to be very ill, or you have a political motive. That's a kind of game I don't think most people, moral people, would want to get into. In any case, the claim of a Holocaust uniqueness had its political usefulness, its serviceability. Namely, if you can claim that Jews suffered uniquely, then you can argue that Jews shouldn't be held to the same moral and legal standards as all other people. And that's how the State of Israel and its apologists came to use the Nazi Holocaust and the uniqueness argument. The claim that because Jews suffered uniquely, you can't hold Israel to the same standard. Beginning in the late 2000s, and everybody here knows, there began this campaign called the New Anti-Semitism, that the world was now, New Anti-Semitism was now rampant in Europe, rampant in North America, and that had, again, pretty straightforward purposes. Number one, the purpose of the New Anti-Semitism was to discredit any critic of Israel as being anti-Semitic. And the actual record on the New Anti-Semitism, there are a couple of things to say. I'll try to do them quickly. Two things to say about the New Anti-Semitism. Number one, it's not new. And number two, it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. First of all, let's look at that first question. Every time Israel faces a major public relations debacle or comes under international pressure to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, a campaign is orchestrated about a new anti-Semitism. So in 1974, if you go to your University of Minnesota library or a good library, you look under the title New Anti-Semitism. You'll find a book put out by the Anti-Defamation League, the main Jewish defense organization. It was put out by the head of the organization, Arnold Foster, and his co-author Benjamin Epstein. What's it called? It's called The New Anti-Semitism. 1981, the head of the ADL at that time is a fellow named Perlmutter. Perlmutter and his wife, they put out a book, Nathan Perlmutter and his wife, Ruth Ann Perlmutter, they put out a book called The Real Anti-Semitism. What's his thesis? There's a new anti-Semitism in the world. And then in 2000, once again, when Israel came under international pressure because of the violence it was using to suppress the Second Intifada, a new campaign began about a new anti-Semitism. Is there any evidence of a new anti-Semitism? The record is pretty clear. Don't have time to go through it now, but for those of you who are interested in the book Beyond Chutzpah, the first several chapters are devoted to going through the record. I'll give you a couple of examples quickly. Number one, let's take the case of Europe. We're told that there's this new anti-Semitism all over Europe. What does the record show? Well, the main public relations the main public polling organization is called the Pew Charitable Trust. Most of you are familiar with it, PEW. In 2004, they went to Europe to investigate this question, among several questions. Whether there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, is there a new anti-Semitism? What's their conclusion? The conclusion will, I think, surprise many of you in the room who listen to the mainstream media. The conclusion was, not only is there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism, but in fact, in target countries, there has been a significant reduction in anti-Semitism since the last time they took the poll in 1991. So rather than there being a new anti-Semitism, in fact, the evidence shows it's less than ever. Let's now take the case of North America, our own society. If you read the publications of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which specializes in the defamation of character of anyone critical of Israel, if you look at the publications of the Anti-Defamation League, you would think that there's a rampant anti-Semitism in the United States. They say it's like the late 1930s when Hitler came to power. We're on the eve of a new holocaust. And the main evidence, or one of their main pieces of evidence, probably their main evidence, is they take the case of the college campuses. They say college campuses are rampant with anti-Semitism. There are pogroms, literally, they tell us pogroms, riots, assaulting Jews in our college campuses. Now, I have to say, on the face of it, that struck me as kind of odd, because I've taught at many universities, not from choice, and it's not a badge of honor, but I've been around the block several times, and I have lots of experience at many universities. And one thing you could say about American college life nowadays, university life, for better or for worse, is that it's so politically correct that you can't be anti-anything on a college campus. You can't be anti-black, anti-Puerto Rican, anti-Jewish, you can't be anti-tall, you can't be anti-small, you can't be anti-fat, you can't be anti-skinny, you can't even be anti-downright ugly. You can't, you know. It has its, I have a mixed feeling about the political correctness, but this notion that amidst all of this, in many ways, stifling and suffocating political correctness, that you can be anti-Semitic and there can be pogroms going on and Jews are being assaulted, is just totally preposterous. And in fact, if you look at the record, I have had a chance to look at the record, there is no evidence to support this claim of a new anti-Semitism on college campuses or anywhere else in the US. And that leaves me 7 minutes. 7 minutes? 5. 6. No. That leads me to the last topic, which in many ways is the most depressing, and still it warrants a few minutes of comment, and that is the third source of all of the controversy, alleged controversy on the Israel-Palestine conflict, is the vast amount of fraud, the vast amount of sheer nonsense that's published on the topic. Now, in and of itself, to say that there's a vast amount of fraud and nonsense on the topic doesn't say very much. We're in the age of internet, and everybody who uses the internet knows that probably about 70% of what appears on the web ranges somewhere between the crackpot and the insane. There's about 30% on the web that has some scholarly value, some authenticity. What's peculiar about the Israel-Palestine conflict is the extent to which sheer nonsense and sheer fraud, the extent to which it's validated, praised, and applauded in the mainstream media among institutions which normally we take to hold fairly high standards of truth. So let me give an example, a recent example, which will enable me to make the point. Is there anybody here who is a professor, teaches at a university? Okay, your name? Deborah. Don't be afraid. I know how everyone hates professors. So Deborah sees me at the end of this lecture, and she says, well, Professor Finkelstein, I listened to your remarks, and I found them interesting, but I have to tell you that I don't think you were really very honest in your presentation. Oh, really? Why? Well, she says, Deborah says, well, I happen to have read a very excellent book last week which said that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. And I say, oh, really? With that haughtiness and arrogance of a professor. I say, oh, really, Deborah? Generally superb. And she says, yes, Norman, generally superb. So I ask her, I do what any typical academic does. I go through these mechanisms of quality control, what academics use in order to keep each other relatively honest. And what a typical professor says one to the other is, I say, Deborah, who published that book? Because we all know that there are different qualities of publishing houses. The least respected are what are called vanity presses, basically people who pay to get their works published. And then the best are the university presses, the University of Minnesota Press, which actually published one of my books, now I just remember, University of Minnesota Press, where they have outside experts read and examine the manuscript. So I asked Deborah, who published your book? Deborah says, well, John Wiley and Sons. Who published the book you read? John Wiley and Sons. Well, that's an excellent publisher. I can't dispute that. It's a mainstream, solid publisher. So she jumped through that hoop. I now ask her the second question. Who blurbed the book? Who wrote comments on the back of the book? She said it got very excellent comments. It got a comment from Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. It got a comment from Floyd Abrams, who's the leading First Amendment authority in the United States. He's the counsel for the New York Times. Well, that's impressive. So then I turn to the third mechanism of quality control, because she jumped through the second hoop successfully. I ask, who reviewed that book? Another standard question. You agree, Deborah? I'm not fabricating these questions. Yeah, okay. The third is, who reviewed the book? And she replies, well, the book got very excellent reviews. It got a review in the Boston Globe, very excellent. Got an excellent review in the New York Times Sunday Book Review by a fellow named Ethan Bronner, who is the Times' resident expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict. He sits on the editorial board. He writes all of their editorials. And Ethan Bronner gave the book an excellent review. Well, it's hard to quarrel with that. Now I'm down, I'm against the ropes, and I leap for that fourth question. Maybe this is the one Deborah had in mind. I ask her, who wrote the book? And Deborah says, who wrote the book? Who wrote it? It was written by the senior-most professor at Harvard Law School, the Felix Frankfurter Chair of Law, Alan Dershowitz. And in fact, she's right. Excellent publisher, excellent blurbs, excellent reviews, and an excellent academic pedigree. The senior-most professor at probably the most prestigious law school in the world. And yet, this is one of the paradoxes of the Israel-Palestine conflict, all of that can be true. Publisher, blurbs, reviews, author's academic pedigree, all of it can be true, and yet, notwithstanding, despite, the book can be a sheer fraud, a hoax, a total concoction, sheer, complete nonsense. And that's what Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, written in 2003, is. The fraud begins, some people argue, there is a range of debate. Some people believe it begins with the first word on the first page, ending with the last word on the last page. And then there are others, I happen to fall into the camp, who believe the fraud begins with the first name of the author's name on the cover of the book. But the book is sheer fraud. I have no time to demonstrate that now for those of you who want to undertake the task. I go through 200, in the book Beyond Chutzpah, I look at every sentence in the book, literally, 250 pages examining it. The book is, it's not difficult to discern the fraudulence of the book. I'll give you one illustration, and I'm going to leave it at that. The illustration is, as I mentioned to you earlier, there's this vast corpus of human rights reports on the occupied territories. And the main thrust of Professor Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, assuming for argument's sake that he wrote it, the main thrust of his book is that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. But what's very striking is not once, literally, I'm not engaging in hyperbole, exaggeration, not once does he ever cite any human rights report to support any of his claims about Israel's record in the occupied territories. Now, it's obviously not because he doesn't want to. Any author would want to use the credibility of a Human Rights Watch or an Amnesty International or the array of Israeli human rights organizations. Any author would want to cite those publications. He doesn't cite them because he can't, because it's impossible to cite any of these organizations, any of their reports, without coming to the conclusion that Israel's human rights record in the occupied territories, far from being generally superb, is absolutely appalling. That's the real record. And that's where I'm going to leave you, on a note of optimism. Now, you may be wondering, how can I discern a silver lining in the cloud which I've just had descend upon you? But yet, I do think there's a silver lining. And the silver lining is this. I don't say it because I feel under a moral obligation to give hope. If it were hopeless, the obligation is to speak the truth. But I don't think it's hopeless. And the reason I don't think it's hopeless is actually captured in all of my remarks this evening. Namely, if you look at the actual record, the International Court of Justice is on our side. The human rights organizations are on our side. The law, legality, is on our side. Truth is on our side. Truth, justice, they're on our side. And truth and justice, I'm old-fashioned enough to still believe. I had to give up many of my youthful hopes and beliefs, but I haven't abandoned my conviction, my belief in the power of truth and justice. They are very powerful weapons if you learn how to wield them. But if you learn how to wield them, those weapons of truth and justice, then I still believe that however much money the other side has, and they have lots, however much power they have, and they have lots, and however ruthless they are, and they are very ruthless, however much power, money, and ruthlessness they have at their disposal, if we can learn to wield those weapons of truth and justice, and it's hard work, it's not easy. If you learn to wield those weapons, I still remain confident, I still remain hopeful that our side, the side that believes in truth, in justice, in a peaceful, lasting resolution of the conflict, one which, as a bottom line, as a minimum, accords equal dignity and equal respect to all sides in the conflict, I still believe that resolution is within reach. Thank you.